The 1998 Ford F-150's engine groaned and labored as it climbed the grade into the Wind River Valley. Jedediah Vance, Jed, to everyone who knew him, gripped the wheel with calloused hands, his knuckles protruding like rocky outcrops of the mountains surrounding this land. In the truck bed sat a few salt licks and several coils of rope, fresh from town in Casper. The scent of Wyoming in late summer was a strange brew: sun-scorched hay, high-altitude pine, and the bitter tang of alkali dust. Jed took a deep pull of it, squinting through a windshield pockmarked with rock chips. At 65, his joints had started barking at him whenever the weather turned, but his blue-gray eyes remained as sharp as a hawk's, patrolling its turf. The Vance Ranch wasn't just a piece of dirt, it was a living thing. It had watched his father, and then him, butt heads with whiteout blizzards and droughts, so long the ground cracked open like a dry creek bed. To Jed, every rock and sagebrush bush had its own name. And most important of all was the fence. The north fence of the Vance Ranch was a bit of local legend. It was red pine, timber his father had felled by hand in the Bridger-Teton National Forest over half a century ago. The posts weren't factory straight. They'd worked over time but stayed tough as nails, driven deep into the limestone by sledgehammer swings that could crack the world. As the truck rolled past the headwater pines, Jed suddenly lifted his foot off the gas. A chill shot down his spine, not from the mountain breeze but from an eerie void in his field of vision. "What in the hell is this?" Jed muttered, his voice a low rasp. He slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded on the dirt trail, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. Jed climbed out, his old leather boots hitting the ground with a dry thud. He froze. The northern boundary, where the proud red pine fence had run for over 2 miles, was now nothing but a gaping hole in the landscape. Not a single post remained standing. The entire line separating his ranch from the land beyond had been ripped out root and branch. The deep holes where the timber had once taken hold looked like open sores on the valley floor. Jed walked the invisible line. His eyes locked on a massive tread marks pressed into the grass. Those were from heavy excavators, the kind of big iron machinery only major developers owned. Across the line, what used to be a quiet, grazing pasture now looked like a rich man's war zone. Piles of building materials, massive panes of tempered glass wrapped in reflective plastic under the sun, and a steel skeleton rising up like the bones of a prehistoric beast. That was Sterling Peaks, Barrett Sterling's ultra-luxe resort project. Jed's anger didn't explode into a shout. It settled at the bottom of his heart like a heavy slug of lead. He knelt, picking up a splinter of wood left near a post hole. It still smelled faintly of resin. The break was fresh proof. It had been yanked out by brute force instead of being dismantled with any care. He looked over at Sterling Peaks. About 500 yards away, a temporary industrial dump had been set up for construction debris. There Jed saw them, his father's red pine posts. They were tossed mercilessly into a jumble of cement bags and scrap metal. Timber that had been hewn with sweat and heart, that had protected cattle through countless wolf-haunted winters, was now being treated like cheap construction scrap. Jed felt his chest tighten. A memory flooded back. A 10-year-old boy standing in a cold drizzle, holding the hammer handle for his old man. His father had said, "Son, this line is Vance's honor. We don't take an inch that isn't ours, but we don't let a soul nudge our markers by a hair either." He stood there in the harsh late afternoon sun, a tall, lean silhouette, alone in the path of the invasion. The silence of the valley was haunting. No machines were running since the crews had clocked out. There was only the wind whistling through the crags. Barrett Sterling hadn't just torn down a fence. He had gutted a piece of history without so much as a "by your leave" to its last guardian. Jedediah Vance wasn't a man for starting a ruckus. He was a cowboy of discipline. He knew if he grabbed the Winchester off the wall and stormed Sterling's office right now, he'd lose the fight before he even cleared leather. The law in Wyoming could be slow as a molasses-covered turtle, but it was the only weapon that could break men who thought money could warp the truth. He went back to the truck and pulled out a surveyor's tape and a worn leather-bound notebook. With the meticulous eye of a hunter, Jed began to measure. He started from the original stone marker to the west, where a V had been chiseled deep into the limestone back in the 1890s. He counted every step, cross-referencing the figures in the family ledger. 5 paces, 10, 100. The further he measured, the harder Jed's brow furrowed. Sterling hadn't just cleared the fence. The new layout stakes for his resort grand entrance were being driven into Vance soil by at least 6 feet. He was swallowing a whole strip of land along the border. Jed stood up, brushing the dirt off his knees. He looked toward the sunset, which was staining the distant Gannett Peak, a bruised crimson. That light looked a lot like blood. "You want a war, Sterling," Jed whispered into the biting wind. "You've got one, but it ain't gonna go down the way you think." He climbed back into the truck and turned the key. The engine roared again, but this time it sounded like a heavy-timbered battle cry. Jed didn't drive straight home. Instead, he cruised along the empty stretch of land, eyes fixed on the abandoned post holes. The ranch felt wrongly exposed now. Without the fence, the view from his porch stared straight into the gaudy modern eyesore of Sterling Peaks. His privacy had been stripped away. It felt like being caught buck-naked in the middle of town. That night, Jed didn't sleep. He sat in his smoke-stained log kitchen, an old plat map and a mug of black-as-ethyl coffee in front of him. The oil lamp flickered over the property lines. He knew Sterling was racing the clock to grand open the resort next month. The man was throwing money at the wall to create a done deal. The rhythmic thud of hooves scuffed against the parched earth, dust kicking up and coating Jed's worn denim jeans. He sat atop his gray Mustang, spine straight as an arrow, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his Stetson. Jed hadn't opted for the pickup today. In this part of Wyoming, when you wanted to talk straight up with a neighbor who thought his wallet made him king, being in the saddle gave you the high ground, letting you look right down on him. The Sterling Peaks construction site rose like a giant eyesore in the middle of the valley. The bone-rattling drone of rock drills filled the air, and the chemical stench of industrial paint and solvents hit his nose, drowning out the scent of the wild grass. Jed reined in his horse exactly where his fence had stood tall only 2 days ago. Now, in place of the red pine, stood polished steel pillars. They were pouring concrete for a massive gate, already crowned with Sterling Peaks, the pinnacle of living, carved into shiny-as-hell granite. Barrett Sterling stepped out of a blacked-out SUV, the door thudding shut with a high-dollar click. He was decked out in pristine white safety gear, his designer leather boots so clean they looked like they'd never brushed a clod of dirt. He held a tablet like a weapon, his face beaming like he'd just hit the jackpot. "Morning, Jed. Out to check the progress. My crews are burning the midnight oil to make sure we're ready for the ribbon cutting," Barrett shouted over the engine roar. Jed remained in the saddle, hands loose on the reins but his eyes stone cold. "I'm here about my fence, Sterling." And the mare moved treak. Barrett shrugged, giving him a don't sweat the small stuff look. He walked closer, gesturing toward a pile of debris in the distance. "Oh, you mean those rotten toothpicks? I had my boys haul 'em off. They were a real blot on the landscape for a five-star resort like this. Come on, Jed. This isn't the dark ages. Why cling to a fence your granddaddy put up? Don't you worry. Once this gate is finished, I'll have my team install a brand new vinyl-coated chain link system for you. Consider it a freebie for my neighbor. Whether it's pretty or not is my business," Jed growled, his voice deep and gravelly like grinding stones. "That fence was on my land. You tearing it down without asking is plain and simple thievery." The grin on Barrett's face flickered. He tapped away at his tablet, spinning the screen around to show Jed a mess of red and blue lines. "Look here, old-timer. Latest satellite GPS. My survey crew clocked her old fence line encroaching on my property by a full foot. I'm just taking back what's mine and doing you a favor by clearing out the trash. We're neighbors. Why split hairs over some scrap wood?" Jed glanced at the glowing screen, then down at the freshly poured concrete footings. "That machine of yours doesn't know a lick of history, Sterling. You're building that gate on borrowed ground. This concrete is rated for earthquakes, pops," Barrett scoffed, the smugness of a rich man finally bubbling to the surface. "I ought to charge you a demolition fee. The days of free-range cowboys are long gone. This is the era of million-dollar capital and luxury tourism. You keep your rundown ranch, but don't you go standing in the way of progress." Jed looked over at the scrap heap. The red pine timbers his father had sweated to hew were tossed in with cement bags and junk metal. Anger sparked in his gut, but Jed didn't let a flicker of it reach his face. He knew these types feared shyster lawyers more than they feared a gun. Progress don't give you the right to pick a man's pocket, Jed said slowly. And the truth don't need batteries to run like that gadget of yours. Barrett shook his head, looking like he was wasting his breath on a senile old goat. Listen, Jed, I don't have time to play archaeologist with you. I've got the permits, the stamped maps, and a schedule that doesn't have a second to spare. You don't like it? Sue me. But I'm warning you, my lawyers bill $1,000 an hour. They'll have you selling your herd just to cover the court costs. He spun on his heel, barked an order at the foreman, and climbed back into his rig, slamming the door. To him, Jedediah Vance was just a stubborn relic that needed to be brushed aside. Jed stayed put. He watched the workers hustling to set the steel frames, dumping fresh loads of concrete into the disputed dirt. Every shovel of wet cement was another pile of Sterling's money being buried in the ground. A seasoned cattleman never wastes energy chasing a loco cow. You just open the gate and wait for it to run itself off the cliff. You sure love spending money, don't you, Sterling? Jed whispered into the grit and haze. Well, keep spending it. Spend it right down to your last nickel on my land. Jed turned his horse and took a slow, easy ride back home. He wasn't in a rush. Back on the porch, he sat in his old creaky rocker, pulled out his pocket knife, and began to whittle a scrap of wood. The sound of the shavings hitting the floor was the only noise in the stillness. That night Jed didn't sleep. He pulled out his best hat, checked his wallet, and quietly headed toward Cheyenne. A 200-mile drive was a small price to pay for what Barrett Sterling was about to cough up. Jed knew exactly what he needed to find in the state archives. Things Sterling's money hadn't gotten around to buying off yet, and things that GPS satellite had never been programmed to see. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the Sterling Peaks site lit up the horizon like a middle finger to the sky. Jed smiled a dry, hard smile. The higher you build 'em, the harder they fall. The yellow light of the Fremont County Records Office spilled over the polished oak tabletop. Jed sat there, surrounded by the smell of old paper, dried ink, and the bone-chilling stillness of history. The elderly clerk peered at him over her reading glasses, her eyes full of pity seeing an old cowboy spend 10 straight hours poring over calfskin maps from the last century. Jed didn't quit. He knew what he was hunting for. Sterling's GPS gadgets were just soulless algorithms based on cell towers and satellite photos taken from the stratosphere. But in Wyoming, land was defined by things you could actually touch: stone markers, dry creek beds, and trees planted as boundary lines back during the Civil War. Found ya, Jed whispered, his calloused finger stopping on a hand-drawn map from 8990. The map had been drafted by an Army engineer named Samuel Thorne. It stated clearly, the northern boundary of the Vance Ranch begins at the Bearhead Rock, running due east-northeast for 2 miles, using the flow of Dry Creek as the field marker. That was the rub. Dry Creek had jumped its banks after the historic flood of '52. When Sterling did his satellite survey, that mindless computer defaulted to the current dry bed as the border, but the original deed and the Vance family's title were tied to the old creek bed, which sat a good 6 feet deeper into Sterling Peaks territory. Barrett Sterling hadn't just poached Jed's land for a gate. He was anchoring the entire foundation of his main guest lodge on dirt that Jed's granddaddy had bought with cold hard gold from the feds. Jed closed the file. He didn't snap a picture with a phone. He had the clerk make him a certified copy with the county surveyor's official red seal. Holding that paper, still warm from the copier and smelling of fresh ink, Jed felt a jolt shoot down his spine. This wasn't a fence squabble anymore. This was a multi-million-dollar ticking time bomb that Barrett Sterling had personally rigged under his own house. On the drive back, Jed passed through the town of Lander. He pulled into a gas station and fed some coins into a payphone. He didn't call a lawyer. Lawyers were expensive and loved to run their mouths about ethics. Jed called an old riding buddy currently working for the Bureau of Land Management, BLM. Hey Bill, Jed Vance here, got a quick one for you. On federal setback regulations for resort builds. Yeah, that's right. Right next to Dry Creek. Can you check if a building permit holds water if the field markers have been fudged? The other end went quiet for a long beat, followed by the sound of shuffling paper. Jed, if the boundary markers are off by more than 10 inches, that whole permit gets redlined immediately for a re-eval. Why are you asking? Somebody stepping on your toes. Let's just say someone's overstayed their welcome. Jed smiled, his weathered eyes glinting under the streetlights. Thanks, Bill. I owe you a cold one at the spur. Returning to the ranch at daybreak, Jed didn't hit the sack. He brewed a pot of stout ginger tea and sat on the porch, watching the Sterling Peaks site. The engines were already humming. Barris' crew was starting to lay Italian marble onto that monstrous gate. Pricey slabs shipped halfway across the world, slick and fancy. Jed took a pull of his tea, feeling the heat spread. He watched the workers busting their humps and felt a twinge of pity for them. They were sweating over something that was about to be leveled. Around 9, Barrett Sterling rolled up in his blacked-out SUV. He hopped out, straightened his collar, looking smug as a cat in a creamery. He glanced toward Jed's place, saw the old cowboy rocking easy in his chair, and let out a mocking smirk. Barrett waved a hand, signaling the Sparkies to start installing the LED accent lights for the gate. Jed stood up and took a slow stroll toward the fence, or where the fence used to be. He stood right at the edge of the construction tape, hands in his pockets. Looking busy this morning, Sterling, Jed called out, his voice sounding unusually neighborly. Bear stopped and hooped his sunglasses over his shirt. Oh, Jed. Still here? I figured you'd be out hunting for some ambulance chaser, desperate enough to take on this lost cause. I'm too old to be jawing with lawyers, Jed said, eyes fixed on the half-finished gate. That's a hell of a portal. Must have cost a pretty penny. Over 200 grand just for the stonework, Barrett bragged, then dropped his voice to a tough guy growl. So I'd suggest you don't get any bright ideas. One scratch on this marble, and I'll have you thrown in the clink for felony vandalism. Jed nodded, looking like he understood perfectly. I hear you. Property is sacred. Say, are you sure those footings are sitting where they ought to? Looks a bit catawampus to the west. Barrett let out a loud, braying laugh that echoed across the valley. Off, old man, our GPS is accurate to the millimeter. You worry about your rickety-ass cattle shed and leave the engineering to the pros. He turned his back, ordering the crew to pour the final batch of concrete for the eagle statue pedestal. Jed didn't say another word. He reached into his pocket, felt the 1890 map and the county certification, tucked them deep, and walked away. Jed's silence gave Barrett a momentary bad feeling, but his ego brushed it aside. He was at the top of his game. This resort was his ticket to politics, or at the very least, doubling his net worth. He didn't have time for a doddering old-timer. For the next 2 days, the Wind River Valley saw a strange sight. Jed didn't come over to argue or complain. He spent his time salvaging the red pine timbers Barrett's crew had tossed in the trash. Jed carefully picked out every beam, polished off the dried sap, and stacked them neatly behind the barn. Meanwhile, Sterling Peaks was shining like a new dime. The site lights burned all night, and the thumping music from the young workers' speakers drowned out the wolves in the high timber. Barrett had even invited reporters from the Wyoming Tribune to write a piece on the transformation of the valley. Jed sat in the shadows of his porch, thumbing his old rodeo buckle. He knew his patience was about to pay dividends. Every brick Barrett laid, every dollar he burned through right now, was just another grain of sand in the hourglass counting down to the end of the line for Sterling Peaks. The thunder rolling in from the Wind River Range sounded like war drums, dragging charcoal clouds that cast long shadows over the valley. Jed woke before the mist had even cleared from the grasslands. He put on his Sunday best, a pair of fresh-pressed Wranglers, a tucked-in plaid snapshirt, and the silver bullhead belt buckle, a gift from the State Cowboy Association 10 years back. He didn't sit on the porch like usual. Instead, Jed stood by the window, watching the dirt track leading into the ranch. At exactly 8:30 a.m., a white Ford Ranger bearing the Bureau of Land Management (BLM) seal rumbled in, followed by a county truck loaded with surveying gear. Leading the pack was Harris, a square-jawed man in his 60s, with eagle eyes that had seen 1,000 land disputes over 3 decades. Harris climbed out, adjusted his sun hat, and gave Jed a nod. "Morning, Jed." That map you sent to Cheyenne yesterday had a few folks jumping out of their skin to hold a meeting over breakfast, Harris said, his voice husky but carrying the weight of the law. I just want things set right by what my father left behind, Harris, Jed replied, nodding toward the Sterling Peak site where the drills were still humming. Right then, Barrett Sterling bolted out of the temporary command trailer. He was buttoning his overcoat on the move, his face a mix of shock and pure irritation. Hey, what's the big idea? This is a private job site. You can't just barge in without a heads up. Harris didn't even look at him, instead flipping open a file on the truck's hood. I'm Harris, federal land surveyor. We've got a report of a boundary discrepancy affecting the Dry Creek Conservation Corridor and private deed rights. This is a formal inspection and a cease and desist on construction until the markers are verified. Barrett scoffed, reaching for his phone like it was a security blanket. You've got it all wrong. I've got full satellite GPS surveys. My team worked with the best in the business. Your GPS is pulling data from 2020. Harris cut him off, his voice like ice. Mr. Vance here just provided the original 8990 plat map. The field markers are tied to the historical flow of Dry Creek before the 50 flood. Per federal law, when a natural landmark shifts, the boundary is anchored to the historical flow if it's the basis of the original patent. Mr. Sterling, you're in deep water. The tech crew began setting up total stations and laser levels. Barrett stood frozen, the phone in his hand vibrating like a leaf. He looked at Jed, who was leaning back against an old pine with his arms crossed, cool as a cucumber, then back at his fancy gate, fresh with its new stonework. Harris walked the disputed strip. Every time the laser let out a long beep, a worker hammered a bright orange iron stake into the dirt. Those stakes didn't follow the straight line Barrett had drawn on his computer. They meandered with the old creek bed, and to Barrett's horror, they sliced right through the center of the $200,000 Gates Foundation. It didn't stop there. The new line stretched toward the half-finished guest lodge. The county's 5-meter mandatory setback was now blown to hell. The high-end lodge at Sterling Peaks now looked like a trespasser caught with one foot over the line. Stop, everybody stop right now, Barrett screamed at the bewildered crews. He lunged toward Harris. You can't do this. I've sunk millions into this. It's just a few yards of dry grass. I'll buy it. I'll pay this old-timer double the market rate. Jed stepped forward, his pace slow but heavy-footed. You still don't get it, Sterling. There are things in Wyoming that don't have a price tag. This dirt is Vance blood and bone. You tried to use money to pave over history, but the land never tells a lie. Harris checked his readings and scribbled into his report. He turned to Barrett. Per Fremont County Building Codes, your project is in gross violation of boundary and water corridor reg. I am officially issuing a full-stop work order for Sector A and the entrance. You have 30 days to tear down the encroachments or provide a legal rebuttal. Otherwise, the county will do the demo and send you the bill. A dead silence fell over the site. The engines cut out, leaving an eerie, heavy quiet. The workers started packing their tools, whispering and throwing sideways glances at Barrett. Barrett Sterling, the man who bragged about million-dollar capital, now looked small and shook up among the orange stakes. He looked at that massive gate, his pride and joy, now just an illegal hunk of concrete waiting for the wrecking ball. He pointed a shaking finger at Jed. You knew this from the jump, didn't you? You let me build it just so you could pull the rug out. Jed didn't deny it. He looked Barrett straight in the eye with the deep stare of a man who's seen it all. I warned you, Sterling. I told you your foundation wasn't solid. But you were too busy looking at your computer to hear an old cowboy's plain talk. You wanted to move fast, but out here we move right. Harris handed Barrett the folder with the bright red seal. Sign here, Sterling. Game over. Barrett took the pen, his hand shaking so hard his signature trailed off the line. He looked back at the investors and reporters waiting at the main entrance, the ones he'd invited to witness his glory. Now they were just going to see the wreckage of his ego. That evening, after the inspectors and crews had cleared out, the Wind River Valley returned to its natural peace. Jed sat on his porch with a cup of cold coffee. Across the line, those orange stakes still stood, carving the glitz of Sterling Peaks and illegal scrap. The thud of an SUV door echoed from the site. Barrett Sterling trudged across the dirt toward Jed's land. This time he wasn't in his pristine white gear or holding a tablet. His hair was a mess, and his designer boots were caked in mud from last night's rain. He stopped in front of Jed's porch, looking up from the bottom of the steps. No fake smiles, no empty promises. "You won," Barrett said, his voice raspy with exhaustion. "What do you want from me now? Damages? You want to watch me go bust?" Jed set his coffee down, his eyes fixed on the distance where his father's old red pine timbers were waiting to be set back in the earth. "I don't want your money, Sterling. I want the line put back where it belongs. And I want you to understand that in Wyoming, people live by respect, not by strong-arming their way through." The silence hung heavy between the two men, broken only by the wind whistling through the crags and the aimless clatter of the Sterling Peaks sign swinging in the breeze. Merritt stood there, shoulders slumped, no longer looking like a high-powered investor, but like a lost traveler who just realized his map was a counterfeit. "I want you to rebuild my fence," Jed said, his voice as calm as a weather report, but every word weighed a ton. "And this time, do it right. Cedar posts, 3 feet deep, with concrete footings for every single one. I won't have the winter winds blowing away the Vance honor ever again." Barrett gave a slow, dazed nod, his eyes hollow as he looked at the orange stakes gutting his life's work. "I'll get a crew on it. First thing next week." "No," Jed cut him off, his gray eyes narrowing. "You're going to sign a black and white agreement. It'll state that any future change to the boundary structures requires written consent from both sides. And you're footing the bill for every dime I spent on that resurvey." Barrett let out a long, defeated sigh. He knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. His New York investors were already blowing up his phone after the BLM shutdown news broke. His reputation was leaking like a sieve, and Jedediah Vance was the only one who could give him a lifeline if they reached a quiet settlement. "Fine, Jed. I'll do whatever you ask. I am sorry for calling your father's fence a pile of scrap." Jed didn't acknowledge the apology. He simply turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Barrett standing alone at the edge of his collapsed empire. The following week, a brand new crew showed up at the Vance Ranch. These weren't Sterling's usual cookie-cutter contractors. They were local handsmen who understood the mean streak of Wyoming weather. They measured every inch, cross-referencing Harris's orange stakes, with a level of care that bordered on the extreme. Jed stood in the yard, thumbing his old rodeo buckle, quietly watching the new cedar posts go into the ground. The sharp, clean scent of cedar filled the air, plugging the holes that betrayal had left behind. Each thud of the hammer rang out solid and true, like a heartbeat returning to the land. On the other side of the line, Barrett didn't sit idle. He was forced to shell out a small fortune for a demo crew to saw off part of the gate's foundation and reroute the underground power. The expensive marble slabs were sliced in two, looking like a white-lipped scar, a permanent reminder of the price of greed. But Bear had learned to keep his mouth shut. He watched his project shrink with a strange, quiet stillness on his face. By the end of the month, Jed's fence was finished. It stood there, sturdy, straight, and proud. The deep red of the new cedar popped against the green of the pasture. Jed walked the line, trailing his hand along the smooth wood. The feeling of privacy had returned. The Vance Ranch was no longer an open stage for city slicker gawkers. It was his fortress again, but something peculiar happened. Once Jed's fence was up, Barrett had his crew build a fence of his own. It was a modern style with dark-stained horizontal slats. However, he didn't share the line with Jed. Barrett ordered his men to set it back exactly 3 inches from the surveyed boundary. Now, between the two ranches, two fences ran parallel, creating a narrow gap just wide enough for the wind to blow through. That 3-inch no man's land looked odd, even wasteful, to anyone passing by. But to Jed and even Barrett, that gap was the most important part of the whole build. It was the symbol of the clean break. It declared, "This is mine and that is yours. We can be neighbors, but we don't ever assume one man's property is an extension of the other's." Late that afternoon, as the last workers packed up, Jed saw Barrett standing on the other side of his new fence. They were separated by 2 layers of wood and a 3-inch void filled with prairie dust. "It's a lot clearer than before, Jed," Barrett called out, hand resting on his modern fence, but eyes fixed on Jed's cedar posts. Land always favors clarity, Sterling, Jed replied, the edge gone from his voice but the authority remaining. Ambiguity is where all the bad blood starts, Barrett nodded, and for the first time he wasn't checking a tablet or a high-dollar watch. He looked up at the peaks turning deep purple in the twilight. While my guys were busting up that stone base, they found an old tin box buried deep, probably from your grandfather's time. I left it on your porch this morning. Jed stiffened slightly. He turned back toward the house and saw a small, rusted iron box sitting on the steps. When he opened it, he found a piece of yellowed parchment and a solid brass spur. It was a relic from Jed's grandfather, the man who laid the first stone of this ranch. It turned out the boundary Jed's father had protected wasn't just dirt, it was a hiding place for family secrets tucked under the fence post. A surge of emotion hit the old cowboy's chest. He looked back at his neighbor. Barrett was still there, the shadows starting to take his face. The hostility hadn't vanished entirely. It had just evolved into a respectful distance. They'd never be grabbing a beer at the spur together, but they'd never sneakily move a fence post again either. Winter came early that year, with the first snows blanketing the Wind River Valley in white. Jed sat in his warm kitchen, listening to the wind howl through that 3-inch gap between the fences. That sound didn't feel like a threat anymore. It sounded like a whisper from the earth, nodding to the man who knew how to hold his ground. The Sterling Peaks resort eventually opened, but on a much smaller, quieter scale. Barrett had to overhaul the whole design to respect the Dry Creek corridor. The place looked more at home now, losing that gaudy, invasive look. Every morning, as Jed rode out to check his herd along the northern line, he'd pause for a second at the parallel fences. 3 inches, a tiny number in the vastness of Wyoming, but the widest gap in the world, the distance between owning and being free. Under the white snow, Harris's orange stakes were long gone, but the boundary line in Jedediah Vance's heart was etched in stone. He knew that when he finally called it a day, his kin would look at these 2 fences and understand. Honor isn't about how many acres you claim, but about how hard you defend the line you draw. The winter sun glinted off the snow, sparkling like diamonds in that precious 3-inch strip. Jed gave his Mustang a light nudge and headed out into the great wide open, where the boundary and the freedom finally became one under the endless Wyoming sky.